I'm going to talk a little bit about patient-centered outcomes in clinical research. So a couple of disclaimers. I'm a medical oncologist, I'm a clinical investigator, and I work for a hospital, sort of the triple threat, I guess, around here. And what I won't specifically be addressing is patient-centeredness in care delivery, although many of the concepts and the data that I'll be discussing are directly applicable, and obviously the information that is derived from clinical research is often intended for clinical care context. So I'm going to start by showing you a study published about 6 weeks ago or so by my colleague Bob Motzer in the New England Journal of Medicine, comparing Pazopanib to Sunitinib in metastatic renal cell carcinoma, in which Pazopanib was found to be non-inferior to Sunitinib in terms of progression-free survival, and overall survival was similar. However, Pazopanib was superior to Sunitinib in 11 out of 14 of the quality of life indicators. Looking at market scan data, and one can debate the source, the range around price information, but the 2011 market scan claims data, which includes the amount paid by payers and out of pocket, was $5,800 for Pazopanib and $7,800 for Sunitinib, although obviously there's a range there. But in general, Sunitinib a little more expensive, but Pazopanib superior in terms of quality of life. Here's a paper of mine. This was from the pivotal trial of abiraterone acetate in metastatic prostate cancer, in which the median time to pain progression was significantly longer with abiraterone. Also, the median time to initiation of opiates was longer with abiraterone acetate compared to prednisone. And this wound up getting into the FDA label. So this is within the clinical trials section of the label that can be marketed on. Again, information about the impact on patients. Now, in contrast, one of the key competitors to abiraterone acetate is enzalutamide, shown here with its own pivotal trial. Both of these drugs approved abiraterone last year, enzalutamide this year. And in this trial, although there were quality of life indices included in the trial, this was not included in the FDA label. They weren't done in a fashion that was amenable to labeling. And as a result, if you look at the FDA label, the only place that pain shows up is here in the adverse reaction section in multiple places, which makes this product look disadvantageous in terms of the impact on patients. Now, in reality, this may not be the case, but the clinical evidence is such that abiraterone acetate has the pain and other symptom endpoints on its side. So why is this information valuable? Well, for patient decision-making, of course, patients wish to know what the experiences of people like them were in similar contexts previously, either within trial context or real-world or non-trial context. But it's also helpful for estimating the comparative benefit risk between various treatments for various stakeholders, including many of you, I imagine. But currently, it is very difficult to find this comparative kind of information in terms of the impact of treatments on the patient experience. Now, if we look at the NCCN guidelines, I'm sorry, it's a small slide, but you get the idea here that when you look at the NCCN guidelines, in this case for prostate cancer, since we're discussing some prostate cancer drugs, you can see a whole menu of options here. I think this is the pointer. Here, you can basically choose any of these, or any of these, or any of these. And included within here, here's abiraterone acetate right next to enzalutamide, the choices that we just discussed. And so when one is thinking about the preferential choice for one of these, the impact on patients, of course, is important. Here's another example. This I was also involved with. This is the ASCO antiemetics guideline, in which the basis of these guidelines is a systematic review of the scientific literature. And at the end of the day with this guideline, the panel concluded, I'll read here, the update committee recommends that studies that include nausea as an outcome include patient-reported measures of nausea. And this was stated because most of the trials looking at antiemetics measured vomiting, episodes of emesis, but they did not adequately measure nausea. But when going out to patient populations, it turns out that what patients care about is nausea, because that's what they are at home experiencing, and it's actually much more prevalent and often more severe. Now, providers care about vomiting, and that's very, as an oncologist, that's reasonable because people who have many episodes of emesis can become dehydrated, requiring intravenous fluids. They can be hospitalized. They can have dehydration that is life-threatening. So this is, one would consider patient-centered ultimately, but what was not included in this trial is an assessment of nausea, which again, patients in their perspectives in qualitative research state as being the most important phenomenon to them. So taking a step back, what's a patient-reported outcome? In the prior panel, you heard some discussion of patient-reported outcomes. Until a few years ago, this term actually didn't exist. The definition, which is largely derived from an FDA guidance on patient-reported outcomes, is an outcome directly reported by a patient or sometimes by a caregiver without filtering of that information by a health professional or anybody else. And these patient-reported outcome measures are the gold standard for collecting information that is best known by patients, right? So in clinical trials, this is most notably symptoms, functional status, and quality of life. But when you step out beyond clinical trials to the care delivery context, we start to think about treatment preferences, shared decision-making, effectiveness, understanding of goals of care, satisfaction, et cetera. And there's pretty abundant evidence at this point that other sources of this information are unreliable. There's a long history of using patient-reported outcomes, particularly around symptoms and quality of life in clinical research, but much less so in contexts that are increasingly salient, like in comparative effectiveness research. Now, what's a patient-centered outcome? So a patient-centered outcome is an outcome that is important and meaningful in a particular population towards making a specific healthcare decision. So it's information that is actionable and meaningful to people when they're making a choice. So patient-centered outcomes are not necessarily patient-reported, and patient-reported outcomes are not necessarily patient-centered, although we try to find that sweet spot in the middle where they intersect. So what is patient-centered research? The methodology committee of PCOC13 has struggled with this question. This is really manifest in 3 of the standards that are included in the methodology report from the PCOC13 Methodology Committee. So many of you know PCOC13 is a freestanding funding organization that was created by the ACA. Within the legislation that created PCOC13, there's a methodology committee which was required to create a methodology report that includes within its standards for conducting comparative effectiveness research. And these standards must be adhered to by those who are conducting funded research by PCOC13. And here are 3 of the standards within a chapter that is specifically about patient-centeredness. First, engage people representing the population of interest and other relevant stakeholders in ways that are appropriate and necessary in a given research context. For example, when selecting research questions, outcomes, comparators, and other elements of the research, right? So this means engage patients throughout the entire continuum of research conduct. The second is to identify, select, recruit, and retain study participants who are actually representative of the spectrum of the population of interest. This speaks to generalizability. And then the third is to use patient-reported outcomes when patients or people at risk of a condition are the best source of information. In the case of PCOC13, the default is to include patient-reported outcomes across the spectrum of research that's being conducted prospectively funded by PCOC13, and a rationale has to be provided if one is not going to include patient-reported outcomes. So what are practical steps we can take? This is a paper of mine from earlier this year towards patient-centered drug development in oncology. And I outlined a number of steps that are largely harmonized with other efforts in this area, which I'll also show in a moment. The first is to begin by conducting qualitative research in a target population to understand the concepts, the experiences, the symptoms, and the other outcomes that are important and meaningful to them, particularly towards making decisions. The second is to evaluate the strategic role of patient-centered outcomes. This particular paper was oriented around drug development, so in this case it would mean having strategic discussions between industry sponsors and regulatory agencies about how patient-centered outcomes play into the development of a product, but this is a much broader concept, obviously. The third is to develop or select rigorous outcome measures, and I'll talk about what I mean by that in a moment. The fourth is to include these measures within trials prospectively. The next is to continuously engage patients throughout the conduct of the research to make sure that the research is on track, to assist with retention of participants, and towards a dissemination and implementation plan that's meaningful, again, within the context of use. And then finally, to actually disseminate those results. So why might PROs, or patient-reported outcomes, be of interest to payers? Well, there's emerging evidence that the way that people feel impacts on utilization of services, not a surprise. But in fact, there has been limited evidence until recently, and in fact, there's growing evidence to suggest that improving how people feel decreases utilization, particularly office visits, supportive medication use, and referrals. Oh, and finally, of course, in the context of clinical research, you need patient-reported outcomes in order to calculate qualities if one is interested in cost-utility analyses. So practical guidance is available from a number of guidance documents. This is from, again, the Food and Drug Administration, in which this issue of conducting qualitative patient work to understand the population is underlined, the use of robust measurement, and using study design that is fit for purpose. Now, this is particularly applicable to regulatory contexts where there's an interest in having measures that very narrowly are applicable to specific outcomes. And in effectiveness research, we actually don't want to be quite so narrow. This is an effectiveness guidance document from CMTP, the Center for Medical Technology Policy, which is a technology assessment and consulting organization, and these EGDs are meant to be analogous to FDA guidance documents, but in the effectiveness context with payers as a target rather than regulators. And this document adds to the recommendations from the FDA by making recommendations for specific outcomes to be used within oncology. And it makes recommendations for specific measures to be used within the context of oncology. A paper was published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology based on this guidance. And just to show you, this is, again, probably hard to see in the back. It's meant more to make a point that very specific symptoms are listed here that are recommended for assessment across oncology trials. Anorexia, anxiety, constipation, depression, diarrhea, dyspnea, fatigue, insomnia, nausea, pain, neuropathy, and vomiting. These are the most common and prevalent symptoms. In a particular context, there obviously will be other experiences that people have that are important, and those would be derived, again, from qualitative research in that population. But these are felt to be important cross-cutting symptoms that should be assessed across trials, not only because they are important to people and will render information that will assist people in making decisions about the best treatment, but because these will also allow us to compare across products in order to understand their comparative impact on the patient experience. Moreover, in this EGD document, a number of instruments are suggested that meet the criteria, the methodological criteria, to be felt to be reasonable for assessing these different symptoms. The NQF added on top of these other guidance documents with a white paper that was issued earlier this year around patient-reported outcomes use and performance measurement, adding the important qualities of actionability, clinical relevance, and the importance of risk and case mix adjustment when using patient-reported outcomes in the setting of performance evaluation. And I don't expect anybody to read this except to show that in the white paper, there's a pathway that's provided for developing and testing patient-reported measures of performance in order to be eligible for NQF endorsement of the measures. Just to give you a few examples of how this is already happening, in England and Scotland, there's a pretty wide scope performance evaluation program using patient-reported outcomes. This has largely been within the setting of elective surgical procedures. So when patients come in to have one of these eligible procedures, there is a requirement that the practice administer a baseline questionnaire, and then a third-party organization administers serial questionnaires over time, including both generic and context-specific measures of patient symptoms and functioning. And what you see here is a typical kind of plot this program uses. It's a funnel plot. You see the median performance down the middle, 1 and 2 standard deviations for the better performers and worst performers on the bottom. And without belaboring it, these data points you see down here represent hospital trust level units that are performing more than 2 standard deviations worse than the mean in terms of how their patients do on these measures of functional status and symptoms. And so these hospital trusts, which are generally smaller units, sometimes just one clinic can be a hospital trust, are targeted for educational interventions and evaluation of why the patients are not doing as well in terms of their symptoms and functioning. This information can also be used for assessing the broad effectiveness of those treatments, and this slide is also taken from the UK PROMS program. There are a number of broader programs in North America as well. There are actually probably about 15 or 16 programs currently. This is just a snapshot. The state of Minnesota has a statewide program for collecting patient-reported outcome information about depression, now have moved into orthopedic outcomes and asthma control. Cancer Care Ontario in oncology has installed computer kiosks across the entire province at oncology practices where patients self-report a battery of symptoms over time. This information is used both to look at effectiveness but also to look at comparative quality. And ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, has created a work group to develop patient-reported outcome performance measures that are specific to oncology, including both symptoms but also metrics around shared decision-making and decision quality. So there are differences in informational interests of regulators versus payers when it comes to patient-centeredness and patient-reported outcomes. Regulators tend to be interested in very context-specific measurement, whereas the payers, as we move into an era where we care about how patients are feeling, generally will be interested in overall and comparative value. In terms of study design, for regulators, again, very rigorous prospective randomized trials, whereas for the more broad interests around reimbursement, comparative and observational data and retrospective data are more acceptable. In terms of the role of patient-reported outcomes, oftentimes in the regulatory context, unfortunately, this is considered supportive of other data, whereas in the context of care delivery, this may actually become one of the most important indicators of value. And finally, in terms of populations highly selected in the regulatory context and generalizable, more generalizable in the context of broader care delivery. So what are our challenges and what does the future hold for this nascent but, as has been pointed out, probably unstoppable area of development? First, there's a challenge around selecting measures. How do you choose how to measure these outcomes of interest? There is increasingly harmonization of consensus standards. I've shown you just a few around how we should select measures and select outcomes. But this leads to problem number 2, which is many different measures, right? There may be some measure of pain over here, another measure of pain over there. How do we reconcile those? And in fact, there are emerging methods for calibrating different measures to each other. The third is missingness of data, right? In real-world context, people may not be as willing as highly selected clinical trial populations to self-report information. And there are many techniques that are now available for engaging patient populations to participate in self-reporting. And there are a number of infrastructure initiatives around the country, several of them supported by PCORI, to build into them mechanisms for optimizing response rates, particularly from the hardest to reach patients. And finally, there's the issue of cost and infrastructure. And there's been quite a bit of movement recently to integrate patient-reported outcomes into electronic health records. Of the major EHR vendors, 2 of them have existing platforms for integrating patient-reported outcomes. Epic is the most far along and has really quite a robust functionality for including patient-reported outcomes. And there's the emergence of networks to aggregate this information, both for effectiveness and for quality assessment. Where much of the discussion now is around using the same data elements for multiple different purposes. A patient comes in, they self-report on their experience. That information lives on the EHR. It is used for clinical care. It's aggregated for quality assessment. It's aggregated for effectiveness research, and ultimately perhaps even for use in the regulatory context. This is a quick plug. Next week, PCORI is sponsoring a workshop in Atlanta that will be available by webinar. This is November 19th and 20th on the use of patient-reported outcomes in electronic health records for anybody who's interested. The PCORI website has the link how to sign up for the webinar. So in conclusion, the patient perspective provides valuable information to support decisions by multiple stakeholders. I would argue that we have an incomplete picture of the impact of treatments on patients without this information. Techniques can be harnessed from prior qualitative and clinical trial patient-reported outcomes research for effectiveness and quality assessments as we move forward, and there are multiple ongoing initiatives in this area. Thank you very much.